Boa tarde, pessoal, tudo bem? Meu nome é Clara, eu falo aqui da ACAT. A gente está, então, agora no quarto dia já, né, do case do Startup Summit 2020. É um prazer estar aqui com vocês. Hoje a gente está recebendo aqui a Michelle Messina. A Michelle, ela é CEO da empresa global de formação e consultoria chamada Explora International. Ela é coautora do best-seller Decoding Silicon Valley, The Insider's Guide. Ela também é coach e mentora de CEOs, já trabalhou em mais de 65 países, sempre focando muito na parte de estratégia empresarial, empreendedorismo e liderança. Hoje a Michelle vai estar aqui falando com a gente, principalmente sobre lições de inovação do Vale do Silício para corporações, focando bastante no que as startups podem nos ensinar. Então, Michelle, é um prazer te receber aqui. You're really welcome. A partir de agora ela vai estar falando em inglês, mas vocês podem acompanhar tudo em português aqui embaixo, tá ok? Michelle, they are all yours.
Thank you so much, Clara. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm so honored to be back at CASE. I was in Sao Paulo 5 years ago for CASE in person, so this is such a unique pleasure to be here virtually. And today I'm going to speak a little bit about innovation for corporations. What is it that we can learn from startups in Silicon Valley? My background is around helping offer global direction and strategy for large corporations and startups alike. And as Clara mentioned, I've worked in 65 different countries around the world, and I love being in Brazil, and I love understanding the challenges that both startups and corporations have in growing their businesses and innovating. So today, we've got some challenges, not just the global pandemic, but we have a globally connected economy, and we've got shifting priorities inside large corporations. The pandemic has forced many of us, to work from home, and we've got to keep our employees safe. Our markets are changing, supply chains have been disrupted, and so large corporations are focused on how do we sustain and grow our business to be much more successful, and how do we keep abreast of all the changes from these changing market opportunities and these changing economic conditions. It's not just about surviving, it's about thriving. You may recognize some of these logos. These are what I would consider corporations that are dinosaurs from the past. So Blockbuster, Sears, a large retailer, the BlackBerry, JCPenney, which was a clothing retailer, Kodak Corporation, Pan Am Airlines, Yahoo, Motorola, TiVo, and Webvan. Many of these companies have downsized significantly or filed bankruptcy and are no longer in business at all. And part of the reason was that they were unable to innovate and change with the changing market conditions or the changes in their customer base. So what we see really from both startups and corporations that I work with, a company dies of suicide, not necessarily homicide. So it's the decisions that the key managers and the leadership team make about what markets, what companies, what changes inside the organization are going to keep the company growing and expanding as the changing conditions in our economy. So let's talk about what a corporation is. A corporation is a large organization typically. It can be 500 employees or it can be 500,000 employees. But basically, some of the attributes of a corporation are that it has product market fit, meaning it has a product in the market that the market wants to buy on a repeatable, sustainable basis. So there's established markets there. They have a business model. They have supply chains. They may have offices throughout the world. They may have hundreds of employees or tens of thousands of employees. As a result of this infrastructure that's grown and built up over many years, sometimes these corporations are very slow moving and are unable to adapt quickly to the changes in the market. But the challenge really is if these companies don't change, they're going to die. And we're going to see more companies go away over the next couple of years as they do not adapt to the global pandemic and the changes in our economy as well. So if you're a corporate leader or a corporate manager, it's not necessarily always easy to know exactly where to start with engaging with startups, but there's lots of different ways to be successful with startups and to find a way to engage with them on a successful manner. There are companies that have set up their own corporate venture capital funds. Some large corporations have created their own innovation labs. Some of them use startups as supplemental research and development for their companies for new product development. Some large corporations have set up accelerators, have created hackathons and innovation challenges that were specifically around a corporate problem or a corporate issue that needed to be solved. Sometimes large corporations do scouting of startups, meaning they're trying to find companies that are in specific vertical sectors that will help them either sell new products to their existing customer base or help them open new markets internationally. So new market creation is an interesting aspect of working with startups as well. And then obviously with tech transfer, how do you get technology out of the university labs, for example, and bring that to the market? Accenture, the large consulting firm, found that 3/4 of large corporations, so about 71%, reported very successful collaboration with entrepreneurs. Unfortunately, a little bit more than half of the entrepreneurs agreed or had that same experience. So the corporations felt it was a good experience working with the startups, but the startups felt it was not as good as the corporations did. So that's an interesting gap that needs to be closed as well. So where do you start? Your people and your team are your most important asset in an organization. And the CEO of Airbnb, Brian Chesky, says, a company's culture is the foundation for future innovation. So your team is really where it's going to start. And diverse teams are some of the best assets that we have in Silicon Valley. There are approximately 7 million people in the greater Silicon Valley area, and 51%, more than half, are born in another country. So we have 120 different languages spoken in the Silicon Valley area, so lots of diversity here. And when you have more diversity around the table developing products or building companies, you tend to get more perspectives, you tend to have better problem-solving skills, better communicators, and a higher team morale overall. The disadvantage of really diverse teams is that sometimes the decision-making process is slower due to extended dialogues. But starting with your team is a really important aspect of being innovative and creative. And there's lots of tools out there that can help you do a better job choosing your team. The Myers-Briggs test has been around since the 1950s, and interestingly enough, this was created by a mother-daughter team to assess personalities. So consider using tools like this to find the best people that can be part of your innovation lead structure. Size of team is really important too. Smaller teams are better for communication, collaboration, and problem solving. So if it takes more than 2 pizzas to feed your team during lunch, your team is probably too large. So remember the 2 pizza team rule when you're building teams to innovate and change inside your organization. There is a management guru by the name of Peter Drucker, and he says culture eats strategy for breakfast. This means that whatever your strategy is, if your culture is not aligned with your strategy, then your strategy will fail. So the culture that you have inside your organization is both your biggest threat and your biggest opportunity. So think about that when you're looking at what kind of organization you have today and what kind of organization do you want to build for tomorrow. So when you're talking to your employees and you're talking to your team management, when you talk about additive innovation, meaning additional new opportunities that are coming forward, those are going to be tolerated by your team, versus the reverse when we're talking about taking things away from our employees and our team. So employees consider these a threat. So we've got to talk about additive innovation. And rather than talking about change, let's talk about new opportunities. People are more receptive to the idea or to the word opportunity than they are to the word of change. Everybody wants change, but none of us really want to change ourselves. So let's talk about new opportunities when we're talking to our team about how we're going to innovate and become something different, better, and more well-suited to the market. So it's important to socialize these ideas pretty freely. We want to make sure that when we're standing at the coffee machine with one of our colleagues to talk freely about what we're working on, what we're thinking about. We want to be able to brainstorm freely without any judgment on the ideas that we surface. It's important to be very open and transparent in this process. This is typically how startups manage their communication process. There's a typical, most startups have open all hands meetings once a week, and a lot of times they're stand-up meetings, so they don't last very long, maybe 20, 25 minutes. But it's an opportunity to share what's going on in the organization. So being open and transparent is another way to get people on board to be supportive of the innovation that's going on in the company. If you're presenting complex ideas, think about using visuals because they're more easily understood than texts are. So it'll take you about 1/10 of a second to see and understand what a visual scene is versus something like 250 words a copy that may take you up to a minute to understand exactly what the message is that's being communicated. So use visuals as much as you can because it does a better job of inspiring fresh thinking with your employees. So we want to be imagining the future in a different way. So if we've always served chocolate cupcakes with vanilla icing, how can we serve mango cupcakes with orange icing in the future? We want to be innovative and creative about what we're doing. So we've got to encourage a lot of experimentation inside our organizations to give people the chance to create, to fail, to see what works and what doesn't work. It's all about trying to better our thought process and celebrate the learning process as well. So what we learn through the innovation process, what we learn as we're building startups, is we learn a lot of times what doesn't work. And that is very interesting and important information for us as well. So celebrate the learning process inside your organizations. That's going to help your employees feel more empowered to talk more about innovation. And when we talk about innovation, we have to be thinking about incremental, step-by-step innovation. So if you look at the image in the lower right, you'll see a series of mobile phones, and you'll see on the far left a body pager, something that people used to wear on their belts 20 years ago. So when you got an emergency phone call, you'd take your pager off, look at it, and you'd see who the number was that you were supposed to call back. So if you think about wearing a pager and you think about having your iPhone in your hand today, it's hard for us as people to understand how we went from the pager to the iPhone. So when we're talking about innovation with our employees, we have to be talking about step-by-step innovation, incremental innovation, because it's too hard to process the leap from the pager to the iPhone, for example. So think about that when you're communicating with your employees. Now, a couple of things to be aware of. You want to watch out for hippos in organizations. Hippos are the highest paid person's opinion. So this means that it might be the senior VP or the CEO of the organization. They may be the highest paid person in the organization. It doesn't mean necessarily that their ideas or their opinions are always necessarily the best ones for moving the organization forward. So you have to watch out for these individuals with respect to blocking innovation, because the most important part that I can share with you about it is that you need top level support. So regardless of what kind of organizational structure you have, whether it be multi-levels of management like we have on the left, which is a typical corporate structure, or a very flat organization like we have on the right, which is pretty typical of most startups. You need top-level support from the CEO and the senior managers. Otherwise, things don't change as quickly as we need them to move within the organization. And we have to understand where the pockets of corporate resistance are. So this particular comic has a number of people sitting around a board table. You can see the graphs in the back where profits are down and sales are down. And someone says, what if we don't change it all and something magical just happens? That's not the way that we can manage a corporation, and that's obviously not the way that we're going to manage through the global pandemic and come out to the other side as successful and opportunistic with new markets ahead of us. You want to also avoid micromanagement. That stifles the creative process, and that prevents people from surfacing new ideas, from looking at their processes, their structure, their communication processes. It stifles that whole communication and creativity process. So don't micromanage while you're talking, while you're managing an innovation challenge or an innovation process. Let people be who they are. Let them be creative. Let them find the best path to success, however you've identified success. You want to simplify as much as you can. So in the United States, a corporate term we use is red tape. So this is considered barriers or obstacles that are in our way to getting done what we need to do. We want to, as corporate managers, cut as much of the red tape out as possible to allow our employees and our team to create, to reimagine, to re-energize their whole process of looking at their existing jobs or looking at new opportunities in the organization. So simplify everything as much as you possibly can. Conduct regular feedback sessions. I mentioned that startups typically have an all-hands meeting every week, that it's sometimes a stand-up meeting. It only lasts 20 minutes. But this is a great opportunity for you to understand what's really happening within the organization and where some of the challenges are, what are the problems, what the learnings are, what worked, what didn't work. So this regular feedback mechanism is really important to understanding how you're moving forward and if you are moving forward. So let's talk about what a startup is. A startup, the technical definition of a startup is that it's a temporary state of being that's searching for a business model. So that means that companies who have not found product market fit, so for example, they're building a product, but the market's not buying it on a sustainable, repeatable basis. Those companies have not found product market fit yet, and they're probably still considered in the startup category. But bear in mind that a startup is a temporary state of being. I do know startups, that some of them that are 7, 8, and 9 years old, so they haven't quite nailed the product market fit yet. But in general, startups in Silicon Valley, they're focused on one thing, which is bending, breaking, and disrupting markets. It's a lot of what we do best here, is just looking at the market opportunity and trying to figure out how do we reimagine it and disrupt it. So when we organize our teams and our company, we organize very flat organizations, but we organize them for speed and intensity because we're trying to move into the market, build a product, get it out to the market as quickly as possible. So as fast as we can move and as intensely as we can work, these things are some of the basic pillars of building a startup, is moving fast and breaking things, as they say. So organizing for speed and intensity is really, really important. One aspect of being a startup CEO or a startup founder is that extreme uncertainty is a normal part of doing business. You're not necessarily sure what the next corner in the road has around it. So it's not necessarily predictable what will happen tomorrow or 6 months from now. So it's important that founders and entrepreneurs and employees working in startups, they're comfortable with this level of uncertainty. A lot of times I find that corporate employees who've been in inside large organizations for a long time, they don't necessarily feel that same level of comfort because they have been used to a large organization that has a lot of existing processes in place, and they're comfortable in that sort of environment. But be aware, in a startup, extreme uncertainty is normal. Constant change is normal as well. So what we did 6 months ago in our company may not be the same thing we're doing today in the company. So we're constantly looking at everything we do as a startup, trying to understand what works and what doesn't work, get as much feedback from the market as quickly as we possibly can so that we can innovate and adapt our product to suit the market needs. A lot of people think that startups' success, especially the last few years when we've been talking about unicorns that have grown to these multi-billion-dollar valuation levels, they think success looks a lot like the straight arrow on the right side of this diagram. In reality, the path of building a startup is more akin to what's on the left of this image. The twists and turns, the ups and downs, the what worked, what failed, what succeeded, what didn't work. This is sort of the normal progression or path of every single startup I've looked at and worked with. I've asked founders before, did you ever think it would take you this long to build a big value company and be able to sell it? And most of them say, I never envisioned it would take me 9, 10, or 12 years to build this company before someone was really interested in buying it. Most of them thought they were able to build enough value in the company and turn around and sell it within a couple years. But it does take a lot of time to build value in the corporation, and it does take a lot of trial and error as well. So startups are focused on getting stuff done on the left side versus on the right side, we have a large corporate structure. We have processes and people and infrastructure and approvals and different things like that for making decisions or green lighting a project. But when you're in a startup, it's all about getting stuff done as quickly as you possibly can. And you've also got a difference in resource capability between startups and corporations. Startups have very little cash, usually. They have very few employees, and they're tasked with doing only the things that really are going to move the needle on building the product and building value in the marketplace. So there's a total difference in the type of resources that startups have versus corporations. There's a big difference in the organizational structures too. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of flatness in startups, and that's what we want. We want people that are working on things that are going to bring value to the organization and not necessarily as part of a process in the overall mechanism or management of the company. So the diagram you see on the left is sort of a tongue-in-cheek or a humorous approach to looking at the startup. We have the hipster, the hustler, and the hacker. And this is basically sort of the best of the founding team. You know, sometimes you have a founder who is also the target user who had personal experience with the problem that the startup is trying to solve. Whereas on the other side of the diagram, we have a management structure that has multi-layers of management or business models or business units, for example. You want to, in a startup, keep it as flat and as quick to make decisions as possible. The communication process in startups usually very transparent. If I was a founder going out to raise capital and I came back from my meeting at 2:30 in the afternoon, the rest of my team would want to know how that meeting went with with the investor. So that's an opportunity for me to share what the investor said about how we're building our business. So transparency in the communication is really important, and that's just part of building a good company. Whereas on the right side of the diagram, the caution sign is in large corporations that I've worked before, there's resistance to sharing all the information. So there's more caution associated with who gets what information at what time. Decision-making speed is a big difference as well inside startups. You find typically that startups are very fast in their decision-making process. And as I mentioned before, corporations have a lot at stake. They have markets that are at stake, customers, offices, supply chains, lots of infrastructure that's at stake. So the decision-making process can be slower because they need to look at all these factors when they're taking on a new project, new product, going into a new market. It's important to be mindful of the decision-making process inside both organizations and understand what motivates them and why it takes the amount of time it does. The product development process is very different inside startups as well. Sometimes it's as simple as a conversation between two people to come up with the essence or the core value of a new product inside a startup. Versus on the right side, sometimes when I was a VP of marketing for a large corporation, we would buy market research reports, and those would sometimes validate what we already knew about the business, but then we'd hold focus groups to get more validation. We had more time and resources and people available to do the checks on whether or not this was a good idea or not. But on the left side of this image, we have startups that have very little to lose. So they don't have all this infrastructure, all these employees and all these offices around the world. So it's easier for them to come up with ideas for new products, understand whether or not there's a market opportunity out there, go out and validate it. It can happen in a very short period of time. So the risk and failure issue is important to note the difference between startups and corporations. Since startups are small, the teams are lean, and they typically are operating with very little cash. They tend to have less that they're going to risk. So their opportunity to try things to see if they work or not, there's much more willingness to do that. Versus inside a large corporation where you've got employees, offices, supply chain, and product market fit, customers, etc. You want to avoid risk and failure as much as you possibly can. So that's, those two things, risk and failure, are the driving forces between the difference in behavior of what startups do and then what large corporations do. So there's a lot of cultural differences. The thing is that there are things that we can learn from the startups in Silicon Valley, the startups that are in Brazil. There's lots of opportunities for us to understand how each one of these groups is different and what we can do to be more like startups when we're building our innovation practice. So I will tell you this, that you're going to have what we call OSMs. These are what we say are oh shit moments. Oh shit moments. This is when things don't go according to plan. This is when something unexpectedly happened that we didn't necessarily know. Startups have oh shit moments all the time. Sometimes it's, as often as once a week where something unexpected happened or the outcome was very different than what the company thought. It does take a long time to build success. Biz Stone is one of the founders of Twitter, and he says timing, perseverance, and 10 years of trying will eventually make you look like an overnight success. So it does take time to build success, to build value in the market, and be attractive enough to your market where you have a long-term sustainable business opportunity. So it's important to manage expectations in your corporate innovation practice or as a startup talking to your investors. It's important to manage expectations appropriately so that people understand what is possible and what's not possible. We want to make sure that we're selectively using the best practices of Silicon Valley, understanding as much as we can about the culture that makes startups so unique, so incredible, and makes them so able to build these crazy big unicorn companies that we hear about all the time. So I want to get back to this. it's important to understand that your culture can help you or hurt you. It's your biggest opportunity and your biggest threat. If your strategy is excellent and your culture is not willing or not able to take in new things and be successful in that reimagination and that innovation process, your strategy won't work. It's really important to understand that culture and how you talk to your people, how you encourage them, how you allow them to do what they do best is going to be your biggest challenge within your organization. So I've collected some resources that might be helpful for you. These resources include some books that are focused on corporate venture capital, that are focused on creating corporate innovation labs, that are focused around what it means to be a corporation and innovate effectively. And I've also put the cover of my own book up there. It's Decoding Silicon Valley. So you can understand some of the aspects of Silicon Valley that can help you become a more effective corporation in your innovation practices. These books are all available online on Amazon, and I would encourage you to think about what resources you're going to read, who you're going to talk to. There's a lot of things out there that can help you, give you a macro view of some of the successes that corporations have had as they've engaged with startups, and to help you understand some of the ways that you can be more effective in bringing your team along with this reimagination, this creativity process. So lastly, I'll wrap up by just sharing a few things that our company does. We work with a lot of corporations. We help them try to get inside the Silicon Valley mindset and be more like a startup. We try to look at their culture and help them understand what aspects of their culture can make them more effective so that they can move forward in their business. And we have lots of connections worldwide to industry leaders, investors, governments, accelerators. I've worked in 65 different countries around the world, so I have a pretty good network. Last thing I'll leave you with is that prioritizing innovation is the key to your post-crisis growth. So today, while we're in the pandemic, we have the choice of being forward-thinking or staying where we are. I would encourage you to prioritize innovation as the way to move through this crisis that we're currently in with the global pandemic, so that you can find opportunities for new markets, new customers, and also find ways that you can engage with startups on a much more effective and long-term basis, because I think there is a lot of value associated with sharing and interchange of the mindset that startups own and help you think and act more like a startup. Thank you so much for the time. I'm so honored to be here at Case Startup Summit again.